Thank you everyone for inviting me here. If you don't know, Spinosaurus is a giant carnivorous dinosaur from North Africa, and there's been debate pretty much since its discovery over exactly what it was doing ecologically, and we'll get onto the hell-heroniness of it in due course. So obviously, people don't know me. I'm a paleontologist. I do a lot of stuff on dinosaur behavior, particular their predation and feeding biology, and I do some other stuff on sexual selection and communication in dinosaurs. I also work on pterosaurs, the extinct flying reptiles, which are not dinosaurs, but everyone thinks they are, that lived alongside them, and all kinds of various other bits of taxonomy and naming species and body size. And I've done a few papers on tails and their growth and all kinds of other stuff together. As many paleontologists do, you kind of end up drifting into lots and lots of different subjects. You can't give a talk as a paleontologist without showing photos of you digging stuff up. Here are some photos of me digging stuff up. Again, there's this bit of a fiction that paleontologists spend all their time in the field digging up bones. A, this isn't true, and B, it's doubly not true for me. There's a reason that most of these photos I have considerably fewer grey hairs because I haven't done much digging in the last 12 years. But I spent a fair bit of time in China and Canada. Here's me digging up a tyrannosaur with footprints, with eggs. And I always have to show this photo in the top left with the weird chandelier, because the sign on the wall that you can't quite read says, "The most magical bone in China." And you have to include a photo of yourself with the most magical bone in China. So there it is. It's a hadrosaur thigh bone, but it's fantastic. The gold plinth and everything just makes it. And I've named a whole bunch of species, dinosaurs and pterosaurs and some other fossil reptiles. There's a rhynchosaur in the top right. There's a whole kit and caboodle to my background, but just to give you a flavor of the sort of things that I do. But today we're talking about Spinosaurus. It's arguably now an absolute A-lister of a dinosaur, basically because of Jurassic Park 3, whereas before that, I think almost no one had heard of it. Both Velociraptor and Spinosaurus have benefited massively from the exposure that's come from the movies. But Spinosaurus is, frankly, a fragmentary enigma. The first finds were in the early 1900s. They were very fragmentary. This is the famous original specimen shown here on the wall in a museum in Munich. There's a bunch of vertebrae, so middle part of the backbone with these famous giant spines and a little bit of jaw. This specimen was destroyed in the Second World War by Allied bombing, which didn't help matters. That, it got a couple of papers described in German of very incomplete remains and then was promptly blown up. On top of that, not everything was described very well. A whole bunch of different species names were proposed, and the taxonomy of these things has been a persistent problem for nearly a century now as to exactly which things may or may not belong to which species. But the earliest reconstructions done by Ernst Stromer, the German paleontologist who described these things, show something that's actually pretty typical for big theropods, carnivorous dinosaurs at the time. Other than the sail on the back, this is basically a T-Rex or an Allosaurus in terms of its overall shape and posture, and in particular, the kind of head shape. It's got a short, big, fat head. It's got relatively long body, a relatively long tail, and apart from these spines, this drawing wouldn't really stand out compared to any other illustrations of big carnivores. And it basically languished at this point and was an oddity that would turn up occasionally in dinosaur books as, oh yeah, and by the way, there's this really big sail-backed thing from Africa, but no one actually knows anything about it at all. And that's pretty much what you see in the scientific literature for the next 70 years or so. When we get into the 80s and 90s, we suddenly get a much better impression of it because of this. This is Baryonyx. This is a animal from the UK. It's nothing like as complete as this illustration shows, but Baryonyx is represented by really quite a good skeleton. There's a pretty good skull, good chunks of neck, good chunks of body, good chunks of leg, good chunks of arms. That gave us really quite a good idea of what a whole animal would look like. it rapidly became clear that Baryonyx was something pretty close to Spinosaurus and was probably part of the same group. We now know that's certainly true. These are both Spinosaurs. And so we go, okay, this thing's probably pretty weird. It's got this big, long crocodile-like skull. It's got some weird teeth. It's got big arms. There's some oddities going on here, and these things are rather more special than just the big sail, and it's a large animal. Now, as a result of plenty of other discoveries, we have quite a few Spinosaurs from around the world. They're really, in the grand scheme of things, these are rare fossils. We don't have that many of them. Where we do have them, though, they're really quite common in South America, particularly Brazil. We actually got quite a bit from the UK and France and Spain and Portugal, and lots from Thailand and that kind of region as well. Mostly very fragmentary. Oh, and plenty from North Africa, I should say. Mostly very fragmentary, but enough that we've got a pretty good idea of what they look like and what's unusual about them. And this figure on the right from a paper I wrote with Tom Holtz a couple of years ago covers that. They have this elongate snout. This is the front half of the nose with this kind of notch. You can see it when you look at it from underneath. There's this real kind of divot with almost no teeth in it, just behind the very tip. They have these greatly elongate spines in the middle of the back. Baryonyx and one group don't have this so much. They're just a little bit big, but the other group, Spinosaurus and its nearest relatives, have to be giant things like this one. They have a really short and very, very thick and weirdly kind of expanded humerus, the upper arm bone, big claws on the hands. And finally, they have some fairly weird teeth compared to other carnivorous dinosaurs. First of all, they're pretty wide in cross-section. They're really quite fat and almost circular if you were to cut them through. They often have really reduced serrations front and back. Carnivorous dinosaurs usually have fairly big and obvious serrations. These are reduced or even entirely lost in Spinosaurs. And they also often have these ridges, as you can see very clearly in this tooth. Actually, some crocodiles, various fossil crocodiles, have something pretty similar, and at least on occasion, Spinosaur teeth and crocodile teeth have been confused. But you can usually tell them apart, and it's an indicator that they have probably something of a crocodile-like diet, that they've got crocodile-like teeth. And in the right places, Spinosaur teeth are incredibly common. It's not hard at all to buy genuine Spinosaurus or other Spinosaur teeth online, because in some fossil beds, you turn them up in the hundreds or even in the thousands. Really quite a long time, we've recognized that Spinosaurs probably have some kind of aquatic affinity, in the sense that they're hanging around in, next to, between various bodies of water, and they're eating things like fish. This is an illustration back from 1998 for Baryonyx, and you can see it's ankle deep in water and grabbing fish. This is, a kind of classic illustration, and this idea is that, therefore, is really not new. Baryonyx, I want to say named in 1988, has fish scales in its stomach, as well as actually the bones of a juvenile dinosaur. But as I said, as already said, the skull shape is fairly crocodile-like. It's long and slender. They've got very crocodile or even dolphin-like teeth, simple cross-section, rounded, pointy things. That suggests they're eating a lot of fish, but we've also got Spinosaurs. We've got one Spinosaur eating a pterosaur, and we've had some isotopic analysis, so looking at the isotopes of teeth that give an indication of what they were feeding on, suggesting that at least some are eating terrestrial animals. So aquatic, but not necessarily, full-time only eating fish, perhaps a more generalist diet. Again, crocodile-like, eat lots of fish, eat lots of turtles and terrapins and things like this, but also quite happy to grab bigger stuff on land if it comes by. And then in 2014, we get basically a new Spinosaurus interpretation following the discovery of a new specimen in Morocco that had particularly short legs. If you actually look back to that earlier stroma illustration, that had fairly short legs. There was a specimen back then suggested to be rather more reduced. And we have this new kind of very short-legged animal, quite a good bit of skull, quite a lot of backbones. All these different colors, I should say, represent basically the various different specimens and even different species that have had to be used to restore this. Even this new specimen, which is the one colored in a fairly dark red, as you can see, is pretty incomplete. Good chunks of the hind limbs, a couple of vertebrae here and there, but the orange stuff and the blue stuff comes from stroma specimens, the yellow and green mostly from other Spinosaurs, not from North Africa, and things start to get a bit more disparate. There's nothing wrong with that, of course. We often have very fragmentary remains. You restore them from their relatives, but you've got to be a little bit careful about just how certain you are of details when doing something like this. But even this interpretation got superseded by the same research group within a couple of years by 2020, once they turned up a tail for it as well. And you can see that we've now got a good idea of the length of this tail, and also that, at least for some of it, it has these greatly elongate spines up top that are also very, very thin. And so new reconstruction with this now kind of much more aquatic animal, and specifically the suggestion that Spinosaurus was an aquatic pursuit predator that is actively chasing down fish in water. But myself and some colleagues and various people online immediately spotted that, well, maybe not. So here's a paper done by Roman Amio, looking at, again, those isotopic signatures from various Spinosaur teeth across North Africa, in this case, from stuff from Morocco. You don't need to interpret the graph in any great detail. Suffice to know that some of the signatures that he got for isotopic teeth showed Spinosaurs eating almost entirely fish, but some of those individuals were eating a great big mass of stuff, and some of those individuals, the signatures that they got were basically identical to other fully terrestrial theropods, which, as far as we know, had a fully terrestrial diet. So if this is an aquatic swimming specialist, it would be weird that some of those individuals appear to be eating only terrestrial animals. So that's a bit of a problem. We also have a question of quite how they'd float. So yet another research group published a paper in 2019 suggesting that the positions of the eye and the nostril in Spinosaurus made it a kind of good crocodile analog, in that it could sit at the water's edge, sit underwater with basically just the eye and the nostril exposed. But myself and Tom Holtz at University of Maryland published a response to this, and this is our figure on the right-hand side showing that, well, kinda, but a fair bit of the head actually sticks up well above the surface when you do this. And if you compare it to animals like hippos, which is the one immediately below it, you see an awful lot of the eyeball is like jacked up well above everything else. And as we'll see, a crocodile in a subsequent slide are just as extreme. And actually, if you compare Spinosaurus up top to modern birds like herons, and indeed other theropod dinosaurs below, actually the eyeball isn't that much higher than the other features, and nor is the nostril than several of these other very obviously not aquatic animals. So maybe, but it's not a particularly convincing argument. And Don Henderson, researcher at the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Alberta, had published this paper in 2018 looking at the kind of floating posture and stability of various different big theropods in water. Don does some absolutely fantastic work. He's very careful with what we'd call ground truthing. So he will make a digital model of a living animal, and I mean an absolute individual. He's done crocodiles and ostriches and penguins and things like this, builds his digital model, sees how they float, and then we'll go back to the zoo and then take videos of that penguin or that elephant in water and see what position it holds or how heavy it is to check his models. And in general, they're extremely accurate. So we're very confident in the results. And Don suggested that if you try and float a Spinosaurus, for a start, it doesn't float really any differently from any other big terrestrial carnivore like Tyrannosaurus. It doesn't appear to float particularly deep in water. And also its body shape means that it would be fairly unstable, which is kind of not what you'd expect for an animal that's perhaps spending the vast majority of its time in water. And then finally, here we have Baryonyx at the bottom and Spinosaurus above. I should say that both of them have fairly incomplete skulls. So these reconstructions are probably accurate in general, but the subtleties are probably different and these may not be 100% accurate, but they're really very similar. So if Baryonyx is not a specialist aquatic animal at all, and Spinosaurus is, shouldn't they be eating different things and hunting in different ways? In which case, wouldn't we expect them to have very different skull shapes? Whereas instead, they're actually very similar, and studies already were out there suggesting that their mechanical performance, what they were good at doing, what kind of forces they resisted, they were very, very similar indeed. So there was immediately some, ideas or things floating around the literature already suggesting that a super aquatic Spinosaurus doesn't really fit too well with all of the data that we have. And so this ultimately led to myself and Tom Holtz getting together for our third collaboration on Spinosaur biology and publishing this recent paper in, I think it came out in January of this year, basically trying to do a big synthesis of everything, like all these different lines of evidence about, and again, I haven't covered everything here that's been said about these animals, but the head shape and the tooth shape and the isotopes and the spines and the feet and how it would float in water and how it might swim and what the environment was like and how the arms might function and all this other stuff, and try and tie it all together and see if we urge towards a more kind of baryonyx reconstruction of it standing in water and grabbing stuff, what I've generally called the Heron Model. Obviously, they can't fly, but big storks and herons like standing on the banks of rivers and basically grabbing fish and snakes and frogs, but also rabbits and rats and other birds and anything else they can get down them, or this pursuit predator model, or something else if that's where we were led. So this is the gestalt kind of final summary of our data, which of course I'm not going to go through in detail, but the very short version of which is every one of these arrows relates to a point that we evaluated in our paper. A white arrow actively supports that hypothesis. A gray arrow is ambiguous or ambivalent. It might or might not, depending on your interpretation, or exactly what they're doing in a given circumstance. And a black arrow would appear to contradict it. So as you can see, we've got white and gray exclusively up top, but quite a few black points below, suggesting that there are some fairly big dings against the pursuit predator model. So let's have a look at some of this stuff. So here's a big analysis of skull shape. It's a fairly simple one, looking at the length and height of that skull to give you an idea if it's long and low or short and fat. And the little blue lines, which you can't see too well, show how close to the top of the head the eye and the nose are for that kind of sitting underwater thing. And we measured a whole bunch of dinosaurs and a whole bunch of big extinct reptiles, including aquatic and semi-aquatic animals, plesiosaurs, pliosaurs, extinct crocodiles, and some living crocs too, and some living lizards too, to see basically where do these guys plot. And you can see here the pink outline, the little triangle for 3 Spinosaurs, sits them entirely within the terrestrial animal group and entirely separate from the orange and pink semi-aquatic ones. So it doesn't immediately look like an animal that's got a head shape or a nose or eye position that are particularly similar to semi-aquatic animals. And again, we see this in kind of modern birds and crocs. So here's that crocodile image that I promised. So here's a crocodile skull in profile. The nostrils are right up the top here to the point you can't even see them. The eye is pretty close to the top of the head. And if you look at the bottom, when you see a crocodile in water, this is when they're really down. You know, the water even goes over the middle of the snout. You've just got a pair of nostrils and the pair of eyes, and that's about it. And you really can't do that with Spinosaurus because so much of its head is taller, basically, than its eyes. And if we look at herons, they have this nostril really quite a long way back from the front of the skull, just like Spinosaurs do. And they still actually have a fairly high positioned eyeball orbit. But this is how they're mostly using it. This is a pair of saddlebill storks. This is a photo I took in South Africa. And you can see they're feeding with the head, quite a bit of it underwater. But of course, their eyes are in a position to look straight down the nose, and the nose is well clear of any water, and they can stick that beak down quite a long way without ever inhaling water and being able to look around and breathe quite comfortably whilst doing it. And so this is what we would say are the options for Spinosaurus in that regard. A is our kind of model. So you see the nostril here, kept clear of the surface with the gray line, and the eyeball looking down and trying to find its food. B would be the Arden model that we've kind of seen of it trying to be a crocodile, but with really quite a lot of its head stuck above the surface. And C, although never explicitly stated, if this animal is swimming around underwater a lot, it's obviously going to have to come up for air. That's what big aquatic things do, like, you know, whales and plesiosaurs and stuff like that. And to do that, actually, it has to poke really quite a lot of its head out because, again, the nostril is quite a long way down the nose. And so this does look a lot like modern animals, and these two don't. So this dipped posture would allow them to forage while partially submerged. But if they were swimming or were themselves submerged, you actually need to get the head really quite clear of the water in order to breathe. And of course, for the crocodile model in particular, you can't hide that sail. It's sticking up and giving your position away no matter what you do. If we look at the body plan, so just the overall shape of animals, we see that aquatic animals generally fall into kind of 4 general profiles, or at least aquatic reptiles. Bow plan 4 are turtles, which I think we can just skim them for now. They're not really relevant. But bow plan 1 is the ichthyosaurs and animals like that, which are very high-speed swimmers. And these are literally aquatic pursuit predators. That is how they hunt. They chase things down, and they have to be quick and very streamlined. Bow plan 2 are animals which are fast over a short distance. These are ambush predators, so they have a burst of speed, but they're not good at long distance or high speed. And bow plan 3, I should say, and bow plan 2 are also animals which have bow plan 2 are these slow burst predators. They're not good at high speed. They can do a flurry over a short distance. Bow plan 3 are somewhere in between. They're quite efficient. You can see they've got highly specialized paddles. They're not super fast, but they're fairly efficient movers. Of all of these, Spinosaurus and its kin are probably closest to bow plan 2. They have limbs. They have arms and legs with claws and hands and feet. They don't have flippers. They don't have a super streamlined body. And of course, that sail is particularly adding to that. And animals that do swim fast, when they do have a fin, it's a fin at the tip of the tail, like we see in the ichthyosaur at the top and this thalattosaur in the middle of bow plan 2. And of course, that's not the tail shape that we see in Spinosaurus. So you could argue to toss over whether it's exactly a bow plan 2 or a bow plan 3 or possibly something in between, but it sure as hell isn't a bow plan 1, which is the one group of aquatic pursuit predators we know of. And indeed, for specialized aquatic swimmers, it's very common for them either to reduce their limbs greatly or convert them into large paddles. Spinosaurus arguably has pretty small hind limbs, but its forelimbs appear to be pretty big, and those hind limbs are not tiny. These tail flukes, as I've said, are usually just at the end of the tail, and we don't see this super hydrodynamic shape. The fin is, the sail on the back is the opposite of that effect. And of course, moving in water is really hard. Anyone who's ever tried wading in water will know just how much resistance there is. And, you know, even the best human swimmers are really very slow compared to, you know, anyone who's just trying to walk along the side of the pool and keep up with them. And the majority of this comes from drag, basically the interaction of the fluid against the body that is moving through it. And larger animals have larger drag, and a big Spinosaurus is, estimates say, over 15 meters, perhaps the largest theropod, or at least certainly the longest theropod dinosaur ever known. And a big Spinosaurus would have had more drag than a small Spinosaurus. And fast swimmers minimize drag. Sticking that sail on the top of an animal, any animal, would massively increase its drag. Sticking it on top of something that's already about the biggest thing trying to move through water is only going to make it much worse. And on top of that, there is surface drag, also known as wave drag, which is effectively a form of drag that is the interaction between the water moving off the animal that's swimming and the surface of the water. You'll have seen a kind of form of this whenever you see a video or in real life of something like a whale coming close to the surface. You can actually, the whole body of water is moving up really before the animal gets there. You know, that water is kind of stuck to the animal, and as a body, it's moving up. There's an awful lot of drag going on there. In fact, drag, surface drag near the surface can be half your total drag. And the way you escape this is to swim deep so that none of the water moving across your body is interacting with the surface. So if Spinosaurus was going to escape surface drag, particularly with the sail on its back, it actually needs to dive really quite deep. This is our reconstruction. Surface drag is basically about 2 to 2.5 times the diameter. So in other words, if you have an animal of this diameter, you take its height, 2.5 times that is how far you need to be below the surface to avoid surface drag. Spinosaurus is a massive animal. Its body alone dictates that it would need to be something in the region of 7 meters depth of water and be swimming at the bottom of that to escape surface drag. And then you've got the sail. So surface drag is a huge problem for an animal that's this size and this shape. And despite the fact that Spinosaurus does show increased density of its bones, something that's very common in aquatic animals, it also still has pneumatic cavities, which is very common for theropods, and suggests that it's probably not that dense, and therefore it probably doesn't sink. In other words, it would have to actively swim and expend energy diving down against its buoyancy to get to 7 meters deep just to escape the surface drag before it can start swimming at maximum efficiency. That's really not a good combination for an animal this big and this heavy and not that streamlined. So what about that tail fin? Well, that sure as hell looks like a paddle. In fact, the Ibrahim's group suggested that this is just like modern newts. Well, there's a problem there because several newts do have this big tail fin type structure, but specifically it's usually present in males, and we know that it's a sexual selection display feature rather than a swimming adaptation. The female newts don't usually have this, or it's only present in males during the breeding season. If this is something that really helps you swim efficiently, they should all have it all year round. And indeed, if we look at Spinosaurus's tail vertebrae, which is one here in A, and we look at this bottom row G through K, which are all swimming animals with swimming adaptations, we see none of them have anything like this. They don't go for big, long, thin rods. They go for short, fat plates. But we do see a bunch of other animals, B, C, D, particularly good examples, which do have big, long, thin rods. And those are not swimmers. Here is B at the bottom. It's the basilisk lizard, the sailfin, which ironically do swim quite well. But again, these are only present in males, and it's a display structure that we know appeals to females. The animal in C, incredibly, is Protoceratops, a desert-dwelling ceratopsian dinosaur, which, as you can see, has these great big long rods off the tail. And some work actually that I did a few years ago suggested entirely independently that these are a signaling structure used by Protoceratops. So these giant spines in the tail, they do look like newt paddles, but newts aren't swimming with them. And they also look just like those signaling structures seen in other lizards, and they don't look like the vertebrae of other swimming reptiles. So if Spinosaurus is an aquatic pursuit predator, we've got some pretty big problems. Its head shape is like other Spinosaurs, which aren't doing that. And indeed, our gestalt analysis shows that actually its head shape is like other theropods generally. Yes, it's definitely more crocodile-like, but it doesn't flag up and cluster with the actual crocodiles and other aquatic animals. Its body shape is closer to those of relatively slow swimmers, certainly not the super fast ichthyosaurs and aquatic pursuit predators. That sail is going to create a huge amount of drag, as will the overall body shape. Henderson has already pointed out that these things are probably unstable in water. That's not a good look for a specialist swimmer. And that paddle, it's not actually very efficient. It's less efficient than those of crocodiles. And actually crocodiles themselves, as we've shown from Plan 2, not particularly fast swimmers. In fact, crocodiles have been described as poor swimmers, not adapted for swimming. To you and I, they're fantastic. I am not going to try and race a crocodile in water, but compared to a fish, they are really not great swimmers because they are hybrids. They're really quite good on land as well. So they don't have paddles. They haven't reduced the limbs. They haven't become super petrodynamic. So a tail paddle, which is less good than a crocodile, which is not a good swimmer, is not an indicator of a super fast swimming animal. And again, we've got isotopic signatures showing at least some individuals feeding entirely terrestrially, which again doesn't match the idea of a specialist swimming animal. But if we switch to the Heron model, and here I have to give credit to my paleontological colleague, Andrea Cow, who kind of coined this. I was already calling this like the Heron model or the stork model. And in his blog, he said, oh, it's a heron. I'm like, damn, I wish I'd thought of that. That nostril position allows them for this dipped heron-like foraging, whether they're standing ankle deep or even chest deep in water. The similarity of the skull to other Spinosaurs, particularly Baryonyx, which doesn't show any of the specializations supposedly present in Spinosaurus, suggests they're feeding in very similar ways. Something I haven't commented on, but there was a neck paper, on the structure of the neck, done by a group. I can't remember who the lead author now was, for whom I'll apologize in advance if he's watching this, but Sarah Joshua Evers was one of the authors on that. He's a guy I know quite well. And they showed that the necks of Spinosaurs are good for striking down rapidly. That makes a lot of sense for an animal that's dipping down into water and less sense for an animal that's swimming actively deep in water. Again, we know that Spinosaurs as a whole have diverse diets, and those isotopic signatures suggest a diverse diet, all of which comes together for an animal that's standing around in water and grabbing what it can. And that led to us getting this new piece of artwork done by the wonderful artist Bob Nichols, showing just that. This animal standing, kind of knee deep in water with the tip of the snout just below the surface and able to smash its head down or down and forwards and grab at any big fish that's coming past. It can probably submerge, down to its chest quite happily. And maybe with those big feet and that tail, it can do a burst of power and kind of lunge like a crocodile forward onto something. But it's not an animal which is 7-10 meters underwater, actively, rapidly going after fish. So that's our synthesis. We do think it was primarily a piscivore. That's mostly what it's going after, and associated aquatic prey. There's freshwater crabs and lobsters and other crustaceans. There's terrapins, there's lungfish that might be buried that could be pulled out of holes and things like this around at the time. It's probably standing in water and striking down at those, but also grabbing birds and pterosaurs and small dinosaurs if it can. It could easily have dug into the ground with those big humeri, big powerful arms and big claws. I'm sure a Spinosaurus that was 15 meters long would scavenge whatever the hell it wants, and anything else that's around is going to let it, and even potentially lunge. And those legs, even though short, are probably quite important. They're going to allow it to move. This is a mostly fairly deserty environment, but with a delta and lakes and stuff like this. The ability to walk effectively between little isolated patches of water is probably really quite important. I should say there were big crocodiles around, similar to modern big crocodiles, as well as big carnivorous dinosaurs. But Spinosaurus is kind of doing better than both. It can walk across the desert or among dry areas to get from water body to water body far better than any crocodile can. So that's an advantage it has over them. The longer-legged, more normal theropods could, of course, stride across very happily, but when they get there, they've got no real adaptations for exploiting the resources and the food that's in and around that water hole or lake or little river when they get there. So our suggestion is they kind of fit into this gap between the two, where they're kind of better at being a crocodile than a theropod, but better at being a theropod than a crocodile, and therefore they can fit into this environment. And that big fan on the sail of the back and that big fan on the tail, we think are signaling structures analogous to what we see in a bunch of other dinosaurs and other reptiles. So Spinosaurus, it absolutely has some aquatic affinities. It probably swam better than other theropods, at least partly because of that tail and the little legs, but it's not a specialized swimmer. We should say there's more to come. The Ibrahim group report that they've still got more material that they haven't described yet, but obviously we still don't, we still don't have a good, complete, true skeleton. There are still these arguments over the taxonomy and have we got 2 or 3 or 4 species out there, which could easily complicate things if one of them is particularly short-legged, or one of them has a particularly big sail, or one of them has a particularly short head and we hadn't realized. And even if it's not a specialist swimmer, it's still a huge theropod. It's really weird, it's really interesting, and it deserves a lot of attention. And that's the kind of take home that I'd really like to push on this. Obviously, I have to thank Tom Holtz in particular, who's collaborated with me on multiple papers on this, a whole bunch of colleagues who I've had various discussions at times with all kinds of different aspects of this project and spin out research, which is still ongoing, and a bunch of people who've lent me their artworks and photographs, either for the papers or for what I've used in this talk. And I'll just finish off with a bit of shameless self-promotion. Here is my website, here is my book, here is my podcast. This is me on Twitter. I have a blog. There are videos of me doing talks online that you can watch. Happily, I have a strange enough name that if you Google Dave Hone Dinosaurs, you'll find me. I think, to be honest, if you Google Dave Dinosaurs, you'll probably find me. So if you want to see more of my stuff, it's real easy to get hold of. But that's the end. I'll stop there and hand over to Jim to moderate the questions. And thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dr. Hone. I will throw out there that for everyone in the audience, we will have your colleague, Dr. Tom Holtz, with us later on in the summer, supporting the Tyrannosaur exhibit. So definitely do watch this space. Looking forward to that. So on to the questions. Why do you think that so many paleontologists look at Spinosaur and see this as a fully aquatic animal despite its anatomy?
I don't know. Is the raw answer. I mean, as I've said, and I like to think I make quite clear, even before these most recent 2014 and 2020 papers, there was a bunch of literature out there pointing to gross similarities between Baryonyx and Spinosaurus, or things like the diverse diet, or things like the isotopic signature, which were always something that was going to have to be explained if they were, I wouldn't say fully aquatic, because that implies they never come on land like a manatee or a whale, and they're clearly not that. But, if they were very specialist animals, that would be odd. There are crocodiles who kind of focus on, big crocodiles and modern ones, focus on taking terrestrial prey, like, antelope and wildebeest and stuff like this, but they still eat plenty of fish. Finding the isotopic signature of something that's basically just eating other dinosaurs is not really what you'd expect. So yeah, I don't know why people think this is such an open and shut case. And as I say, that's partly why we wrote this paper, is to say, well, okay, let's try and look at everything rather than a couple of details and really go through the whole set.
All right, so this one's a little more general. So can you speak in a little more detail about how it's possible to look at fossils from different locations and identify them as, is this one species or is this a similar species, but it's actually different?
Well, in the case of Spinosaurus, as I say, that's a really contentious thing that has been ongoing for a long time and is still happening right now. So I mentioned this recent study of neck function. Now, that's from an animal which some paleontologists, including me, would say is from a Spinosaur, but an animal called Sigelmassasaurus, which is a horrible name, I know, from North Africa, that's hanging around at the same time as Spinosaurus. Other people think that Sigelmassasaurus is Spinosaurus. Part of the problem there is we have very few neck vertebrae for Spinosaurus. So we've got this lovely complete neck of Sigelmassasaurus and basically nothing else, and then some other bits. And so how sure are we that those bits line up with that neck and that it is or isn't the exact same thing is a very reasonable question. And of course, it causes some consternation. If Sigelmassasaurus is something different, then that stuff that I'm talking about, that vertical striking, becomes a little more contentious about whether or not that applies to Spinosaurus or not. Though for the record, it's actually the other research group who say it is Spinosaurus. So they're actually the ones dragging that into the discussion, if you like. Generally, what we do, as again, is a more general sense for paleontology, is you're looking at basically overlap. So, you know, if you have a head and neck of one animal, and then the neck and body and front legs of another animal, and then the body and hind legs of a tail of another one, you've got some big chunks of overlap. And if they basically look the same, particularly if they're roughly the same time and place, or you found them in a big group together, it's really quite reasonable to say that they're almost certainly the same thing. But yeah, there are absolutely fossils out there where, you know, someone's named a head and someone's named a body, and 50 years later, someone found a whole skeleton, and we go, oh, they're the same thing. Plants are particularly notorious for this. I think the record for fossil plants is something like 15 different species, because the flower, the seed, the nut, the leaf, the stem, the root, the bark, all got named as different species. And then one day someone finds basically a whole fossil tree, and you're like, we now know they all go together. But it's a perennial problem in paleontology, in that we can't do that very easily a lot of the time because stuff just doesn't overlap. But it's also not a confusing problem in the sense that it's often fairly easy to work it out when we do have good overlap. So I think people think it causes a lot more problems than it actually does, because we're always on the lookout for it. We always appreciate that that's probably happening for non-overlapping pieces. And as I say, it's often quite easy to resolve with one good specimen later.
Okay, so I've got a couple questions I'm going to kind of merge into one here because they're kind of related. Can you speak in a little more detail about isotopic signatures and how you can use those to identify what an animal's diet was?
A little, but not much, because it's really not my area. And Romat in particular is an absolute world expert at this. But the short version is particularly carbon and oxygen isotopes. So isotopes are versions of atoms that have an unusual number of neutrons, and so they are heavier than the normal one. Various biological processes, these are always present naturally in an environment. They just occur naturally. However, basically biological physiological processes actively prefer the inverted commas natural isotope, the common one, from the other one. So if you're a predator eating say a big predator that's eating another predator which is eating a herbivore, each time you've been eaten as an atom, the animal next up in the chain is preferentially excluding them. Excluding those heavier isotopes. And what that means is at each different trophic level, that ratio of natural and rare ones will alter, and the rarer ones will become rarer and rarer. So that's one thing you can immediately do to see how far up a food chain something is. And if it's basically a herbivore, where it'll have something pretty close to the plants, or a carnivore where it'll have something quite different. But also aquatic animals, of course, are fully immersed in water all the time, or they're drinking huge volumes of water. So things like hippos mostly feed on land on terrestrial plants, but of course they spend huge parts of every day in water, and they're just consuming and inhaling huge amounts of it, because why wouldn't you? You live in water and you're not too fussed about that. And so they tend to have signatures which are closer to the aquatic system. And the other side of this is that water in particular, when it evaporates, which is the kind of thing you get in things like deserts, The lighter natural isotope will tend to evaporate slightly faster because it is lighter, it's more prone to that. And so you'll get different concentrations of isotopes if you're living in water or you're on land. So between those two different contrasting things, we can get the idea of something's position in the food chain, and whether or not that food ultimately originated in the water or originated on land. In the case of the stuff that I showed, more simply, you can just compare them. You know, we know that fish are eating stuff in water. We know that carnivorous dinosaurs are eating stuff on land. So you can simply just get the Spinosaurus signature and see which one it looks like. And as I say, depending on exactly which tooth you look at, some look like fish, some look like crocodiles and turtles that are doing both, and some look like fully terrestrial animals.
Thank you very much. That was a great explanation.
Oh, good. I just hope I've got it right, though I'm sure someone will correct me sooner or later if I haven't. But I believe that's roughly correct.
Okay, again, this one is a little more general. Can any of your research with body sizes support that atmospheric oxygen levels were higher during the time frames of the species that you're studying?
That's not the kind of stuff I look at with body size. I'm more interested with basically what kind of sizes or how sizes evolved over time, or kind of estimates of size, because it's very important for those kinds of things. To my knowledge, there's no good evidence that any of the dinosaur body sizes is linked to atmospheric oxygen. It would probably have helped, but it's not driving or facilitating that. I should say this is an area I really don't know much about. But the easy way of looking at that is go to the top of the Himalayas or go to the top of the Andes. You know, there are naturalized human populations that live at very high altitude where the proportion of oxygen isn't necessarily any lower, but the fundamental amount of air, and therefore the amount of oxygen available for you, is. And those people aren't now tiny. And indeed, if you go to those things, yeah, you've got to hang around for a couple of weeks and then adapt. You know, you'll be very out of breath the first few days, but you can acclimatize to areas of much lower oxygen than ground level Earth with no difficulty at all. So it would seem strange that, you know, a slight increase in oxygen atmosphere would suddenly facilitate animals reaching 10 times the size of any other previous ones. So I just don't think it's correlated.
Okay, so we do have one more question. Around what time period would Spinosaurus and its relatives have been living?
So most of the ones that we've got are, I want to say, the kind of later part of the early Cretaceous and the earlier part of the later Cretaceous. There is no official middle Cretaceous, they just isn't early and late. But therefore, you're mostly looking at the middle. There are a couple of exceptions. So there's a tooth that actually I worked on from eastern China, which is, southern China, which is fairly late Cretaceous. It's something like, I want to say 30 million years younger than any other Spinosaurs. It's a single isolated tooth. It's possible we've misdiagnosed it and it's not a Spinosaur. We were fairly careful to say probable in our paper. Crocodile experts have looked at it. Spinosaur experts have looked at it. I think people are happy that it is a Spinosaur of some description, actually specifically a Baryonyx. It's closer to Baryonyx than Spinosaurus. And that suggests they have a much longer record. The other problem we have, as I sort of touched on this earlier on, they're kind of an odd animal in that when you do find them, they're present in big numbers. There's loads of Spinosaurus stuff in North Africa, and not just all those isolated teeth, quite a few bones, even if they tend to be isolated skeletons. And again, similar southern UK, South America, etc., Thailand and others. But as a whole, they're really rare. So it's very hard to say quite what their extent is when we just don't have that many fossils. Spinosaurs are widely regarded as being very close to the megalosaurs. They are a group who are absolutely around in the middle Jurassic. That's a hell of a lot older. Spinosaurs could have been a very late branch of this, but if they appeared rather earlier, it could well be that Spinosaurs are knocking around for 50, 60 million years, and we just don't have any fossils of them, or we just haven't recognized it. There's some teeth from from Tanzania, so Eastern Africa, which have been named as a new species, Ostafricosaurus. Whether or not they actually represent their own genus, whether or not they are truly Spinosaurs, is uncertain. I think they probably are, and if so, that puts them in the late Jurassic at least. So this is the famous Tendaguru beds that gave us what used to be Brachiosaurus, is now called Giraffatitan, and a whole bunch of other very well-known African dinosaurs. So Spinosaurs could well have been around in the late Jurassic, if not the middle Jurassic, and there's that one tooth from the fairly late Cretaceous. So if so, they were around for a good long time. If Ostafricosaurus isn't a Spinosaur, if my tooth isn't, then whoop, they're in a fairly narrow band. But either way, that lack of fossils outside of these areas where they're super common is really unhelpful. If I remember right, there's like one bit from Australia which has been suggested to be a Spinosaur, and there's one claw in the US which has been said to be a Spinosaur, but neither of them are, I wouldn't say unconvincing, but there's just so little of them, it's hard to be really confident. I would say they're both plausible, but no one really lists them as, oh yeah, that's that Spinosaur claw. It's like maybe. And indeed, on that subject, and I know I'm rabbiting on and not answering questions, their absence in North America is kind of weird, because even if they were going in the middle or late Jurassic, the world, certainly North and South America, were well separate from other things at that point. We've got loads of Spinosaurs in Africa, loads in Europe, and loads in East Asia. It is very difficult to get from any of those three locations to South America without going through North America first. From China and Thailand, it's much easier to hop across to Alaska and then go south. From Europe and even North Africa, it's probably easier to hit North America. And remember, they were rather closer at that time than making it all the way across to Brazil. The obvious conclusion is you never know. Obviously, rare things happen. But the obvious conclusion is they probably went through North America, in which case, where the hell are the fossils? Because it's not like they did it in a couple of years, and that's why we didn't find them. They'd probably do it over hundreds of thousands or millions of years. Or even if they made it to South America quite happily, you'd assume that sooner or later they'd head north. North America was separate, but not, a lot closer to North America than to Africa, and they never seem to have made it. Or are they just rare and we haven't found them? But I'd also suggest that either of those also doesn't really point to a super specialist swimmer. If they were that good in water, they should get worldwide very quickly, hopping across an ocean. Crocodiles do that really quite easily. Even now, you find crocodiles hundreds of miles out to sea. Give them a few tens of thousands of years for the right conditions, it's fairly easy for them to spread, which is why we find crocodiles and alligators on most continents. Spinosaurs didn't manage that. That suggests, I think, that they're not that good at swimming and not that good at dispersing.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Hone. We don't have any more questions, and we are running short on time, so we'll go ahead and bring them to a close for today. Thank you all for joining us today. Thanks again to Dr. David Hone for helping us discover more about our world. Please join us next week on Wednesday, May the 19th at noon for The Science of Stigma, presented by Mary Beth Wall. She is a social worker and the director of programs for the National Alliance on Mental Illness of Virginia. You can register for next week's talk at smv.org. Each talk is free to attend and is open to the first 300 registrants. Thank you again for joining us today. Until next week, stay safe and stay curious. Thank you all for coming.